That's what we got. Okay, so that's, I'm going to say something, and I'm not letting you go. We got more, we got way more. But what I'm going to say now, and don't ever want to stand up all at once, like wait half an hour before you stand up, is that this is the line. Everything before this can be on the exam. Nothing after this will be on the exam. Okay? Now that said, the stuff we're about to do is the same thought process that went into this model. So it is useful to go through it. It's not like I'm just wasting your time. You'll tell me. But in terms of the questions I will ask, they will be like in the past. Everything from here on, not on the exam. So the plan for the rest of the class, which is not much, there's not much rest of the class left, is today and Tuesday, I'll talk about the Phillips curve. And in doing so, we will use the same sort of logic that we used when we were talking about this model, a slightly different model, but it will be the same sort of logic. So it's useful in that way. And then on Friday, a week from today, we will have a review session. So I will just stand here and I will answer all the questions that people bring me. Okay. So let's talk about the Phillips curve. And the big thing I'm trying to get at with the Phillips curve is something called the Lucas critique. Okay. So this is the next chapter in the book. If you have some other book, it probably does not exist. Most introductory books do not have the Phillips curve. A couple of them do. Our book isn't unique in this way, but by and large, if you got something from the library, fine, right? Now for this, you know that nothing I'm about to say is on the exam, so you can relax a little bit with the notes if you so desire and just soak up the glory. That's fine. But I don't know, I think it's pretty cool. But that's just me. What can I say? I'm some kind of geek. Okay, so what is this Phillips curve? This is a curve named after Mr. Phillips. And in 1958, Mr. Phillips, or Professor Phillips, or Dr. Phillips, or, Jim, depending on your I don't know what his first name is, Mr. Phillips, he was looking at unemployment and inflation. Now, back in the day, they didn't have good measures of inflation, right? So he was looking basically at wage inflation in the UK. So it wasn't inflation in general. What he was looking at, it was like the thing he could measure going back 100 years, and that was how wages change. And he couldn't do that perfectly either. Well, no one can do it perfectly, but he had a century of data. So he had 100 years working with. So he's going back to the 1850s, right? And what he found is that higher inflation is associated with lower unemployment. Well, that's kind of cool. And then everyone said, hey, that's kind of cool. And they started checking this out. So he had done UK with this particular measure of unemployment and this particular measure of inflation. And then everybody, their brother and their dog, they all got together and they all started doing this same thing over and over and over again for different countries, different time periods, different ways of measuring inflation. And it was extremely robust. It is probably the most robust thing that we ever found in macroeconomics. There may be a competitor, but I don't know what it is. Like, it was really, really, really strong relationship. In terms of empirical relationships, this is honestly, in macro, as good as it gets. Like, every time inflation went up, depending on wherever you measure it, unemployment would go down. Okay? And so, they worked and worked and worked at this, and it was glorious. A thing of beauty. There's something we know. There's all these theories, and it's all goofy, and kind of, guys are making up curves and shifting them around. What the hell is that? But this is actual data about actual human beings. This we know. Of all the things in macroeconomics, this was the best. Like, unemployment goes up, inflation goes up, unemployment goes down. Okay? Glorious empirical. Like, we will never find such a great empirical relationship again in macroeconomics. It's really was a thing of beauty. Every country, every time period, always. Lovely. Here it is. Hey, inflation, unemployment. The higher inflation, the less the unemployment. You may notice that I have an SR put on here. That's a clue of things to come. But at this point, this was just the Phillips curve. PC, Phillips curve. Named after Mr. Phillips because he found the curve. So there you go. He immortalized, being taught to undergraduates 70 years later. So it's kind of awesome, right? Well, okay. And so they kept doing this, right? He was in 1958, but they kept doing this. They kept updating it, and it was true in the 60s, and it was looking really good. Okay, so this is one thing that we knew. We didn't know a lot, but we knew this. However, at that stage, it was kind of an interesting thing. It was like really interesting to academics, but it wasn't useful in any way, right? Because we were on the gold standard or some version of the gold standard, and so you really couldn't just change inflation, right? You could say, okay, if we could increase inflation, unemployment would go down, and that might be nice, but it's not something you could do. Like some years, like you'd have shocks and unexpected things happen, and inflation would be high or inflation would be low, but it wasn't a tool that you could play with, right? Because you had to have the gold in the vault, and so you only had so much. You couldn't increase the money supply the way we do now, right? Willy-nilly. So you say, oh, if only we could, then we could reduce unemployment, but you can't, so what, right? Kept academics in business. A bunch of people got tenure in fancy places, and that was lovely for them, and they could send their kids to college, and it was great. But in terms of actual impact on the world, not so much. After 1972, things changed, right? In 1972, gold standard is gone, or our facsimile of the gold standard, Bretton Woods, is gone. And so now, if you want, you can print money. Right? And so if you can pick any money supply you want, you can pretty much pick any inflation rate you want. And so now, if we print money, eventually inflation is going to happen. We haven't, but eventually inflation is going to happen. And so then unemployment should go down, right? But this is the Phillips curve. Hundreds of years of data, every country, all the time. It works. And so this is great. This is a new tool that we had because we left the gold standard. Now we have a way to affect unemployment that might be really useful. Okay. So here's what happened. So you can follow the dots. I don't know. It is not as clear as it was in the 100 years of data before. Things clearly are different afterwards than they were before, right? So there you go. Like look at this. This is not you increase inflation, unemployment goes down. Here, I don't know. It's a bit of that. Like here, this kind of looks that way. This kind of looks that way. But what about this? Right here, we got low unemployment here with low rate of inflation. Here we got high rate of inflation. So going from here to here, what? We increased, so going from here up to here, right? That's the thing that happened. We increased inflation, nothing happened to unemployment. Right? That's not the Phillips curve. That's something else. And so what we want to do is we want to understand what's going on here. Okay? Now, one thing we could do is we could break it down into particular years and say, okay, for a while it looked like that, and then for a while it looked like that, and we're ignoring all the goofy stuff that happened in the middle or the goofy stuff that happened before, and then we can pretend like maybe this curve is shifting or something, but why, right? This is a thing, so. All right. So what's going on? How did we have this empirical regularity that worked everywhere and worked for huge amounts of time, was really strong? Why did it suddenly break down in 1972? Okay. So we can tell the same story that we told for the short-run aggregate supply curve to explain this. So remember, the story is firms and workers agree on a wage, and there's going to be a short-term contract with that. Right? And then things happen. Okay? And this wage that we picked is based on what we expect the inflation rate to be. Right? And if inflation ends up being higher than expected, we expected 5% inflation, we got 10%, so workers are cheap. Right? We have to sell less product to hire a worker, so we're going to hire more workers. Okay? We talked about it before in terms of output going up, but we can just as easily talk about it in terms of unemployment going down. Right? We hire more workers, we don't fire people as easily. If they're caught stealing a little bit, they're so profitable, I just keep them. Right? And it's fine, and so unemployment goes down. Right? It's exactly the same mechanism that we had before, except now we're thinking about it in terms of unemployment instead of output. But by and large, when output goes up, unemployment goes down, and vice versa. Not one-to-one, not every time, but by and large. Okay. Yeah, the same story. So we have our short-run aggregate supply. We have our expected inflation. If we get the inflation we expected, we get potential output, the normal level of output. If we get the inflation we expected, everything is normal, and so we get the unemployment that's normal, the natural rate of unemployment. Right? There's nothing natural about it, it's just whatever's normal. Right? Normal amount of unemployment. And if inflation is higher than expected, they find workers cheap, and so they hire more of them, output goes up above potential output. If inflation is higher than expected, they find workers cheap, they hire more of them, unemployment is lower. Right? It's exactly the same story. Just we're graphing it in terms of unemployment instead of graphing it in terms of output. But you can see the same story gives us this Phillips curve, this relationship between unemployment and inflation, okay? As long as inflation expectations stay the same. Okay? However, if inflation expectations go up, this curve is going to shift up in exactly the same way that short-run aggregate supply would shift up. Right? When inflation is 5%, we set a 5% wage increase on average. If we get inflation more than that, they hire more workers, unemployment is less. If inflation is 10%, we set a 10% wage increase. And so if we get 10%, we get the natural rate of unemployment. If we get higher than 10%, they find us cheap and they hire more of us, unemployment goes down. If we expect 15% inflation, again, we set 15% wage increases. If that's what we get the natural rate of unemployment, and so on. It just shifts this curve up and down when we renegotiate our wages. Okay? Exactly the same story we had for short-run aggregate supply. And this, of course, is why I'm saying is the same reasoning that we had for the last model, for this model, because it's exactly the same thing, just thinking about it in terms of unemployment instead of output. Okay. Okay. Here's where we get to Uncle Milton Friedman. We can think about this in terms of what's called the quantity theory of money. And the quantity theory of money is kind of a theory, it's kind of an accounting identity. It just depends on how you think about it. So we have, like, we define a few things. M is the money supply, P is the price level, CPI, for example. Y is real output. So now for this, we're changing our definition of Y. Right? Before, always up till now, Y has been the nominal value of all the stuff we produce, right? The market value of all the stuff. And now we're thinking about it as the real stuff, like how much stuff? 500,000 candy bars or whatever, right? Now, how do you do that without the price level? Well, you can think about that we found nominal GDP, and then we divided it by the price level to get real GDP, and that's Y. Okay, so we've redefined the letter Y here. And this is very annoying for a class because I really should call it something else so that we don't get confused. However, it's written this way all the time, so it's better you can know it when you see it rather than me redefining it to be consistent in the class. You have to be careful. Are they talking real GDP? Are they talking nominal GDP? Here we're talking real GDP. Okay. And then, well, these are all things we've had before, but here's one more thing, V, the velocity of money. And this is because economists are really, really jealous of physicists, And so they want to use all their terms as much as possible. And so we got velocity, the velocity of money. What does velocity of money mean? It means how many times does a euro get spent in a year. Right? So if the velocity of money is 1, then an average euro gets spent once during the year. If velocity of money is 2, it means the average euro gets spent. Whoever got that euro goes out and spends it again. Right? So it's just how many times it gets spent. Okay? Now, we naturally think it's really high because we spend the euros really quickly, but of course, a lot of the money supply is bank account balances, and they don't necessarily get spent during a year, so it's the average of all of this stuff. Okay? So velocity, like how would we calculate velocity? We would calculate it like this. We'd say, well, how much stuff got bought? Like this is the amount of stuff that got bought. Multiply it by the price. That gives us the total value of euros. That's just nominal GDP, the GDP that we know and love. P times Y here is now just nominal GDP. So it's the amount of purchases that happened during the year. And then we divide it by the total amount of money that's out there. And that gives us how many times each money got spent. Right? And that's velocity. Okay? And that is an accounting identity. This is true. This is, in fact, the definition of velocity. And so we can rearrange that into what's called the quantity theory of money just by multiplying both sides by V. The total amount of money times the velocity. There's 100,000 euros out there. We spend them twice in a year. 200,000 worth of purchases happened. And that must be equal to the purchases that happened, which is the total value of things that got bought. Okay? And this is always true. It is, in fact, what velocity means. Which is a weird thing to say if we have the quantity theory of money, because this isn't really a theory, this is more like a definition. It's entirely a definition. So the theory bit comes about when we talk about what do we think these things actually are. And so the quantity theory of money would suggest that V and Y are pretty stable in the long run. That is, Y is like long-run aggregate supply, right? There's a potential output. In the long run, Y is going to be around potential output, certainly by changing the money supply, right? Printing more euros, printing less euros. We're not really changing potential output. That has to do with productive capacity, our work ethic, and all of that stuff, like really producing stuff would be how many factories do we got, that kind of thing. Changing the number of slips of paper out there in the economy isn't going to change potential output. So in the long run, Y is probably pretty stable. And V, velocity of money, how quickly we spend money, is probably pretty stable too. And why do we think that? Well, our story for that would be, what is money? Money is the thing that makes purchases easy, right? It is our liquidity. It is the medium of exchange. If we weren't holding the money to make purchases, or maybe make purchases, we'd hold something else instead. We'd buy bonds and actually get an interest return. So we're holding this money in order to make purchases, or at least be able to make purchases if something comes up as a precautionary motive, right? So we're holding this liquidity, and this, like how much do we need to spend to make our purchases, how often we're likely to spend this is probably pretty stable because we're holding this money to make purchases. That is the point of the money, is to make purchases, or maybe make purchases if we need to. And so because there's no other motive, the velocity should stay fairly constant, at least in terms of monetary policy. Now, I will say that velocity has been changing a lot over time because what is money and the nature of money in our economy has been changing over time, right? That is, we have more. For a while, we didn't have ATM machines. Now we've got ATM machines. And now we got the cars that go ping, and now we can do it on credit as well, as back in the day you couldn't do purchases on credit. And so velocity has been changing over time. But in particular, the quantity theory of money, people would say, well, it might change long term for other reasons, but it won't change just because we change the money supply. Okay? Now this is probably a little strong too, because if we went to hyperinflation, we know, for example, in interwar Germany, when they had the hyperinflation, they would get wheelbarrows full of money at lunch break so that they could go off and purchase. So the velocity of money was really high there, right? They would spend it before 1 o'clock rather than hold it during the month like we do, right? So it's not that literally velocity doesn't change, but for normal levels of inflation, for normal times, the argument is it doesn't change very much. Okay? So extreme versions of the quantity theory would suggest that they don't even change in the short run. Okay? And there are some people that are like into this, like as a thing. That is, money supply doesn't change output. Well, we saw it's a long convoluted chain of events to get money supply to change output. Right? You change money supply, that's supposed to change the nominal interest rate, that's supposed to change the real interest rate, that's supposed to change investment, and that changes output. So anything can go wrong in that chain. So some people say that that chain is very tenuous and really output is going to stay the same as you change the money supply. Okay? Right. So if you buy that, if you buy that V is constant and Y is constant, at least in the long run, then anytime we change the money supply, it's just going to affect prices by this accounting identity. Right? And so if we double the money supply, we are just going to double prices, okay, in the long run. And depending on how strictly you hold this theory, maybe in the short run as well. Okay? And so I've been sort of alluding to this all the way through the course where we say, we double the money, we double the prices. If we change the money supply, we change inflation. It is this that I'm alluding to, that this accounting identity, we think that velocity is fairly constant and Y is fairly constant, at least in the long run. Any change in the money supply in the long run has to be reflected in prices. Okay. Okay. So if that is true, or some version of that is true, then I can pick the money supply. I couldn't before, right? Back in the gold standard days, I could not pick the money supply. But now, thanks to President Nixon, now we can all change our money supply willy-nilly, and so we can do that. Okay, at first it's kind of scary, but then you see the opportunities. It's not just threats, there's also opportunities. And the opportunity is, well, if I pick the money supply, I'm picking inflation. Right? If I decide to increase the money supply by 20%, and sort of the quantity theory kind of holds, at least in the long run, then I can also change the price level. And that's true. Like even if you don't buy the quantity theory as literal, if you increase the money supply, eventually prices will go up. So you can increase inflation if you want to. Well, why would you want to? Look, unemployment goes down. And like that could be good. Like unemployed is bad. It's a bad thing. We would like to have unemployment down, and maybe we're willing to accept a little bit of inflation to make that happen. Okay, that's where we are in 1972. I will let you go, and we will continue this on Tuesday, and have a good weekend.